This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Lo Kuei Su. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. An ambitious growth target plans for more fiscal stimulus to support the economy and spur consumption. Plus, another solid increase in defense spending. We break down a jam-packed agenda at China's Two Sessions gathering. Beijing also waiting to see what Washington does next. The longest ever first presidential address to a joint session of Congress, as Donald Trump talks up tariffs and other America First actions, or saying he's just getting started. Hong Kong-based CK Hutchison offloads its stake at the Panama Canal to a BlackRock-led consortium. Those decisions giving the U.S. firm control of key docks amid pressure from Mr. Trump to reduce Chinese influence in the area. Wet weather giving some hopes of relief as Japanese firefighters continue to battle the country's worst wildfire in 50 years. Thousands have been evacuated and dozens of buildings damaged by the blaze in northern Honshu. And also on East Asia Tonight, a look at the works of Chinese architect Liu Jiakun, who won the field's highest honor for affirming architecture, celebrating the lives of ordinary citizens. China set a GDP growth target of around 5% this year amid the risk of a full-blown trade war with the United States. Premier Li Qiang unveiled the closely watched target at his annual work report at the opening of the National People's Congress. This is China's top legislature. CNA's Tang Zihui with this report.
Keeping the GDP target at around 5% and aiming to create over 12 million new urban jobs. Chinese Premier Li Qiang said these goals were set in response to evolving dynamics domestically and globally.
经济增长预期目标为5%左右，既是稳就业、防风险、惠民生的需要，也有经济增长潜力和有利条件支撑。 并与中长期发展目标相衔接，突出迎难而上、奋发有为的鲜明导向。
Presenting his government's annual work report to nearly 3,000 deputies of the country's top legislature, Mr. Li said China aims for a budget deficit of 4% of GDP in 2025, up from 3% in 2024. Some analysts say the goals show that the authorities want to save ammunition for later and that China is reluctant to increase spending significantly right away, given the threat of tariffs. They say maintaining the around 5% GDP target also signals the government's commitment to stronger fiscal and monetary support for domestic demand amid an uncertain external environment. Challenges that the Chinese leader addressed head-on in his work report.
从国际看，外部环境更趋复杂严峻，可能对我国贸易、科技等领域造成更大冲击。 单边主义、保护主义加剧，对国际经济循环造成阻碍。
Premier Li urged officials to implement policies swiftly and decisively, acknowledging the fragility of domestic economic recovery due to weak demand and sluggish consumption. On the fiscal front, Premier Li said new government debt is expected to total 11.86 trillion yuan this year, a 2.9 trillion yuan increase compared to the year before. Ultra-long special treasury bonds totaling 300 billion yuan will be issued to support the consumer goods trade-in program, and the government will also expand the role of the People's Bank of China in managing financial risk and stabilizing the economy. Since last year, Premier Li Qiang has stopped the traditional annual press conference at the end of the two sessions. Media will look out for briefings by top financial regulators and Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi in the coming days. These will provide deeper insight into the initiatives announced by the Premier, in particular incentives to boost consumption and strategies for navigating what he described as an increasingly uncertain external environment. Tan Cihui, CNA, Beijing.
Let's go live to our Beijing correspondent, Olivia Xiong. Olivia, it's not just the government work report, there's also the draft budget and defense spending.
That's right, Wei Su. We also saw China announce that it will be raising its defense spending by 7.2% this year. And this is the same quantum of increase that we saw back in 2024. And in the budget report released by the Finance Ministry today, it said that it will provide stronger financial and policy guarantees for the modernization of national defense and the armed forces. And we do know that China is facing several challenges on the security front. We're talking about those territorial disputes in the South China Sea and East China Sea as well, and tensions over the self-ruled island of Taiwan. The Chinese premier in his government work report today saying it will oppose separatist activities aimed at Taiwan independence and external interference so as to promote the peaceful development of cross-strait relations. Now, analysts say this is largely in line with the kind of language that Beijing has used before to describe cross-strait ties, even though Beijing has been angered and sees as provocation the actions of the self-ruled island under the leadership of William Lai, whom it has labeled a dangerous separatist, also angered by those close ties with the U.S. But despite that, analysts I've pointed to say that we should remember that this increase in defense spending is largely in line with expectations, given that its long-term trajectory is for China to modernize its military and develop a world-class military by mid-century. Wei Su.
Olivia, you have a guest with you to help us unpack announcements today.
That's right, Wei Su. There's a lot to unpack in the government work report, and I'm joined by Shui Tianchen, who is a senior economist at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We were talking about the government work report. We know that overall it seems that the targets announced for this year are within expectations. It's an ambitious goal of 5% GDP growth, though, but it seems there are also promise of greater policy support. Before we get to your comments, I want you to have a listen and perhaps weigh in on some of the comments that our team got from the delegates of the NPC. Have a listen.
如何在这个环境过程中发展自身的能力，自己呢强身健骨，是我们要做的事情。你像海尔呢本身，我们在全球呢是布局，海外的销售呢已经占到了53%，比例是很大的。那么在这过程，我们在美国也有很大的销售。那么遇到这种变化以后呢，我们肯定要很好的调整自己的战略，来适应这种变化。这也是对企业的一种考验吧。
财政政策，中央要发力，要举债，中央要有这个加大的这个投资啊，包括基础设施啊，包括两重建设啊，包括两新的工作。这样中央发力的话，实际上就能够带动企业，对吧？特别是民营经济、民间资本的投资。
Tianchen, the Chinese premier seemed to want to send a message to project confidence in China's long-term economic growth. We've heard there from the NPC delegates. What do you think? Is what the premier said, the government work report, is it enough?
I think largely so. Yeah, you know that if you ask me about, whether China will achieve the 5% or so target, I would say it is there or thereabouts. Yeah, so I think it will be, let's say, driven by strong fiscal stimulus. Yeah, although we know that there will be a lot of, uncharted waters related to Trump's new tariffs. He just announced that last week. Yeah, and there will be some, lingering domestic weaknesses. The property sector, youth unemployment. Yeah, so these are said to be still problems. Yeah, but I would say I would like to mention that there's a very important sentence in the government work report referring to, the dynamically adjusting the policy response to the economic reality. So that means if the economy gets really bad, then we'll probably see a very resolute and timely response. And I would say that commitment will further provide some confidence for us.
So there is some room for maneuver for the Chinese leadership. But you mentioned their uncharted territory, especially with the U.S. But interestingly, in the Chinese premier's speech, there was no specific mention of the U.S. in his report. But we do know that's the background. So how much of what do you think was announced today was actually hedging, China hedging against what they may expect from this new Trump administration?
Well, I think the biggest thing for China is probably, let's say, win in the competition with the U.S., or at least not to lose the conflict, not to lose the war with the U.S. Yeah. So if we read into the government work report, then you'll probably find many things. I mean, in many things, China is framing the language around the China-U.S. competition. So think of stimulus. So stimulus is partly aimed at countering the negative impacts due to U.S. tariffs. Yeah, and think about the commitment to more technological advancements, more research, more resources devoted to that. Yeah, and that is also reflecting an intention to sort of break the technology blockade by the U.S. Yeah, and if you also think about those investments made into bolstering China's national security, food security, and energy security. Yeah, so these are sort of aiming at making China able to fend off the external threats. Yeah, for example, due to a tech war or maybe due to an energy war, for example. Yeah, so I think here and there you see references that are sort of implicitly targeting the U.S.
Kind of veiled references, so
right.
to speak. I think one other big thing in the report was on consumption, right?
Yes.
Consumption, interestingly, if we were to compare the reports this year and last year,
yes,
boosting consumption has been moved up to the #1 task.
Right.
Compared to last year when it was the #3 task. But we have been talking about boosting consumption for some time now. Authorities have moved. Do you see any difference this time around, or are there different challenges?
Yes, I think they are gradually becoming more serious about really lifting private consumption. And this is also, again, against the big backdrop of a U.S.-China conflict. Yeah, because that sort of means that you cannot rely on export for growth in 2025, and you need to dig into the potential from domestic demand. Yeah, so in that case, we are seeing, let's say, more money being thrown into boosting consumption through subsidies, and there's also the reference, to child-rearing subsidies. Yeah, and there are also indirect, non-financial support. For example, giving you more holidays, for example, and as we are enjoying this year, right? Yeah, and there will be also, different kind of support towards social security. Yeah.
But we talked about one of the big things is the trade-in scheme. That has been one of the primary stimulus measures that the government has used to boost consumption. What other schemes could be rolled out then? Moving forward, if we are talking about, we haven't heard much about implementation, but the government has indicated it wants to do more. What more could it do?
Yes, that's a very important question. So first of all, as you mentioned, we already have the doubling of the entire subsidy program. That was very successful last year, and the intention is to continue. Yeah. On the other hand, if we look at maybe at a more local levels. Local governments, they could be rolling out their respective subsidies, for example, especially towards, services consumption, maybe accommodation, entertainment, recreation, and so on. Yeah, but also, I think one thing in China's calculus is its intentions to boost consumption with, let's say, more supply-side approaches. Yes, so that probably is difficult to understand, but think of the success of, the movie哪吒 2. Yeah.
Would also be boosting the digital economy, AI be another aspect of boosting consumption, perhaps, given that focus?
Yes, because, all the AI thing, China is right now massively deploying, AI as a sort of an infrastructure. Yeah, and it is probably creating a lot of, different, because you have a right now very cheap AI resources that could give rise to AI-enabled applications, AI-enabled electronics, or AI-enabled, let's say, equipment. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of room for imagination.
I just want to pull up also this graphic, just to get a sense of what people are talking about, especially online. We see trending items like policies to address the shrinking population and boosting birth rates, including providing childcare subsidies, comments by Xiaomi boss and NPC delegate Liu Jiakun, and more. Is this perhaps an indication of social aspirations, and how does this factor into the leadership's calculus in boosting the economy? Because it would seem the Premier's audience as well is domestic very much.
Yes. I think the government work report is a rally call. Yeah, and I mean all the policy changes since last September has sort of boosted the social sentiment, boosted the confidence, and so on. Yeah, so I would say that all the Chinese government should do is to continue this rally, and that could mean a more continued stimulus, which will create jobs, create more demand, and probably second, more reforms, so that gives people hope, of maybe sustained growth, and maybe finally more innovation. We know about the DeepSeek sensation, and there could be more to come, so. There probably still some room for maybe optimism in the future. Yeah.
Do you think any of it also was directed, though, besides the domestic audience, to the foreign investors? Because we know that foreign direct investment into China has dipped in January by more than 13% year on year, and last year the dip was 27%. Yeah. How much of what we saw today is able to give confidence to foreign investors?
Yeah, I think this is where the issue gets more complicated. Yeah, because when our colleagues surveyed foreign enterprises about their biggest concern about investing in China, so the first one is weak domestic demand, which is known to everyone. Yeah, but the second is geopolitics. China can definitely do a lot about boosting domestic demand, boosting consumption. Yeah, but regarding geopolitics, I mean, it takes two or it takes more, I mean, to really get things done. Yeah, so think of what if the U.S. Expands its investment screening mechanism, which is essentially blocking U.S. firms investing in China. So that's a big problem. Yeah, so I think China needs to do its own things well. Yeah, but it probably also needs some luck. I mean, in terms of the stabilization of the geopolitical relations and so on.
There's a lot of careful maneuvering and uncertainty that lies ahead, and that's why you mentioned that China has probably left that room for maneuver. Yes. Thank you so much, Tianchen, for your time. I was speaking with Xu Tianchen, senior economist with the Economist Intelligence Unit. Tomorrow we are expecting a heavyweight news conference on the economy, and much more details expected on the broad plans that have been laid out so far today. But for now, back to you, Wei Su.
Oh, thanks. CNA's Liu Jiakun there speaking to Xu Tianchen. Still out on East Asia tonight, President Donald Trump calls for an end to a landmark multi-billion-dollar semiconductor chip subsidy law. And later, NVIDIA's main supplier, Taiwan's Hon Hai, posts a 25% jump in revenue as it deals with uncertainty surrounding tariffs from the U.S. administration and sustainability of the AI boom. And Roland Lim is standing by with business news updates. Roland, from scrapping the CHIPS Act to resurrecting an ailing shipbuilding sector. There's a lot to unpack from President Trump's first address in a joint session of Congress.
Yes, lots to unpack. Investors in the region shifting their focus from uncertainty around President Trump's policies to Beijing's annual meeting of the National People's Congress. Investors cheering China's economic targets, which they hope will offset the impact of a global trade war. Pledges of more support for domestic consumption and the tech industry also boosting sentiment. Shanghai Composite adding 0.5% for the day. Shenzhen Component, the second bourse, up by 0.3%. The Hang Seng Index clawing back all its losses since Friday when the U.S. levied additional tariffs, while the Hang Seng Tech Index, well, that surged 4% high today. Shares in CK Hutchison led the charge in Hong Kong, closing up nearly 22% after soaring as much as 25% in intraday trade. And that's after it agreed to sell its lucrative Panama Canal ports to a US-led consortium under fierce pressure from President Trump. Hong Kong-based conglomerate CK Hutchison is stepping back from the business of seafaring commerce. The firm, owned by Hong Kong billionaire Li Qiang, is offloading its stake in two major ports at the Panama Canal to a BlackRock-led consortium. That gives an American firm control of key docks amid pressure from Mr. Trump to reduce Chinese influence in the area. CK Hutchison will be selling 90% of its stake in Panama Ports Company to a group led by BlackRock. The consortium will also acquire 80% of CK Hutchison's port operations in other key markets such as the UK, Germany, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Mexico, and Australia. In total, the Hong Kong firm is expected to receive about $19 billion in cash proceeds from the sale. CK Hutchison has faced increased scrutiny amid Trump's demands to limit Chinese influence in the area. The president had previously called for Panama to lower fees charged to U.S. naval and merchant ships, and even threatened to reclaim the canal if such terms weren't met. Now, about 12,000 ships used the canal last year, which connects 1,920 ports across 170 countries. Its position is strategic for the U.S., as more than three-quarters of all vessels passing through originate in or are bound for the U.S. Also in the U.S. president's sight, a landmark bipartisan bill that sought to end American reliance on foreign-made semiconductors, which has brought in some $400 billion in investments from chip makers. Now, Mr. Trump called on Congress to scrap the CHIPS Act.
Your CHIPS Act is a horrible, horrible thing. We give hundreds of billions of dollars, and it doesn't mean a thing. They take our money and they don't spend it.
The act was one of the Biden's administration's key policy enactments, providing some $280 billion for scientific research, of which nearly $53 billion was earmarked for revitalizing America's chip industry, which further breaks down into $39 billion in grants and $11 billion for advanced chip research, as well as loans and tax breaks of up to 25%. This comes just days after Taiwanese chip giant TSMC announced a $100 billion investment in the U.S. over the next few years, in addition to the existing $65 billion that the firm had committed under the CHIPS Act. Now, President Trump credited the tariff threats for TSMC's decision. Asian chip giants TSMC and Samsung are two of the biggest CHIPS Act beneficiaries. Now, they were said to receive some $6.6 billion and $4.75 billion, respectively, in direct government funding. American chip giant Intel has also been granted nearly $8 billion. Now, these are among the 20 companies that reached binding CHIPS Act agreement with Biden officials. And Mr. Trump did not specify, though, whether he would attempt to claw back money that's already been dispersed. President Trump also calling to revive the country's shipbuilding for commercial and military vessels in order to counter China's dominance. The Wall Street Journal reports that an executive order is in the works. It includes 18 measures ranging from raising revenue from fees on Chinese-built ships and cranes entering the U.S. to establishing a new office to strengthen the domestic maritime sector. China is the world's biggest producer of container ships. Almost a third of vessels in service today, when measured by container capacity, were made in China, according to data firm Liner Litica. Chinese shipyards account for about 70% of new container ship capacity on order. Now, in comparison, the U.S. industry has been in decline. Industry observers are skeptical of America's ability to quickly revive its shipbuilding sector, citing high labor as well as raw material costs. China's industry, though, has in recent years competed, with Japanese and South Korean companies to emerge as the leader in price as well as industrial know-how. Taiwanese electronics giant Hon Hai Precision posted a 25% increase in revenue for the first 2 months of this year, as demand for AI computing continues to expand. The firm, also known as Foxconn, recorded sales exceeding some $33 billion in January and February, accelerating last year's 11% growth, as analysts project revenue to reach nearly $50 billion for this quarter alone. Now, this comes amid growing uncertainty over U.S. tariffs. The firm supplies tech giants NVIDIA as well as Apple in factories from factories in China, as 20% tariffs on Chinese imports kicked in yesterday. Stocks of the company ending the trading day in the green. And that's it for business. Wei Su, back to you.
Oh, thanks for that, Roland. I'll still head on East Asia tonight.
To my fellow citizens, America is back.
Donald Trump says he's just getting started as he talks up achievements in his first address to Congress since returning to power. Well, this is East Asia tonight. Here are the headlines we are following. China sets a GDP growth target of around 5% for this year amid the risk of a full-blown trade war with the United States. Premier Li Qiang unveiled the closely watched figure in his annual work report at China's top legislature.
To my fellow citizens, America is back.
In the longest ever address to Congress, U.S. President Donald Trump touts his sweeping agenda from the economy and immigration to tough new tariffs. He says he's just getting started. Hong Kong-based CK Hutchison offloads its stake at the Panama Canal, giving an American firm control of key docks amid pressure from the U.S. to reduce Chinese influence in the area. U.S. President Donald Trump spent nearly 2 hours speaking to a joint session of Congress today, the longest ever such address in the chamber. The Republican leader outlined his administration's policies and achievements, touching on immigration, defense, and the Russia-Ukraine war.
6 weeks ago, I stood beneath the dome of this Capitol and proclaimed the dawn of the golden age of America. From that moment on, it has been nothing but swift and unrelenting action to usher in the greatest and most successful era in the history of our country.
Mr. Trump reassured Americans that he is doing what he was elected to do. That would include cutting down on what he calls the most sweeping border and immigration crackdown in American history. And slashing government spending. Mr. Trump also gave his reasons for launching tariffs that have triggered retaliation from China, Canada, and Mexico. He repeated a long-standing grievance on what he considers unfair trade practices and promised reciprocal tariffs next month.
April 2nd, reciprocal tariffs kick in. And whatever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them. That's reciprocal, back and forth. Whatever they tax us, we will tax them. If they do non-monetary tariffs to keep us out of their market, then we will do non-monetary barriers to keep them out of our market. There's a lot of that, too. They don't even allow us in their market. We will take in trillions and trillions of dollars and create jobs like we have never seen before.
He also hailed billionaire advisor Elon Musk's push to dismantle the federal bureaucracy, saying that his administration is just getting started. Mr. Trump also doubling down on his controversial vows to take back the Panama Canal and acquire Greenland from Denmark by one way or another.
Panama Canal was built by Americans for Americans, not for others, but others could use it. But it was built at tremendous cost of American blood and treasure. 38,000 workers died building the Panama Canal. We strongly support your right to determine your own future. And if you choose, we welcome you into the United States of America. We need Greenland for national security and even international security, and we're working with everybody involved to try and get it.
On Ukraine, the president maintained it was time to end a senseless war and noted that he appreciated the latest communication from his Ukrainian counterpart. This is days after a televised political fallout at the Oval Office.
The letter reads, Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians, he said. My team and I stand ready to work under President Trump's strong leadership to get a peace that lasts. We do really value how much America has done to help Ukraine maintain its sovereignty and independence.
And the chair is prepared to direct the Sergeant-at-Arms to restore order to the joint session.
Dozens of Democrats walked out in the first hour of the speech after House Speaker Mike Johnson ordered the removal of Democratic lawmaker Al Green, who refused to stop heckling Mr. Trump. Several other House Democrats walked out while wearing Resist T-shirts. Nick Harper has more on divisions in the chamber.
We saw that very clearly, a visual representation with half the room, the Republican half, standing up, cheering almost every single line of Donald Trump's speech. The Democrats remaining in their seats, poker-faced throughout. And I think Donald Trump played on that division. At times it felt like a campaign speech. The number of times that he referenced his predecessor, Joe Biden, really as being the root of all the problems in America. I mean, it's not normal for this type of address to a joint session of Congress to speak so much about the past. It's more often forward-looking about things that he's hoping to achieve. And yes, we saw that protest. Democrats, throughout the course of that incredibly long speech, left in droves. Some of them held up signs. One said simply false. Another one said Musk steals. Another one said save Medicaid. And then we saw that protest very early on in the speech from Al Green, a 78-year-old Democrat from Texas. He stood up and was saying you don't have a mandate while waving his cane in the air. The House Speaker Mike Johnson told him to sit down, to be quiet. He didn't. He was then escorted out. He said afterwards to reporters that it was worth it to let people to know that there are some people who are going to stand up to the president. But it's not clear if he'll face any formal punishment. But it was certainly a moment very early on in the speech showing that Democrat resistance, that pushing back against the president and some of the claims that he was making. I mean, I think it has to be said he spent more time speaking about tariffs and tariffing other countries than he did giving specific details on how he would reduce the cost of living at the moment. And he reiterated that pledge to bring in reciprocal tariffs on April the 2nd. That will be against a whole host of countries and come in a way that tries to replicate the tariffs that they have in place against the United States.
Mr. Trump's speech sparking reaction in East Asia as well. Seoul refuting the president's claims that South Korea's average tariff is 4 times higher than that of the United States. South Korea's trade ministry clarifying that tariffs on imports from the U.S. stood at around 0.79% as of last year. That's thanks to the free trade agreement between the two. Meanwhile, South Korea's acting president, Jang Soi-muk, has ordered a review of the impact of U.S. tariffs on Canada Mexico and China, which went into effect yesterday. Mr. Chai pledging support measures for South Korean companies that are operating in those countries. He's called for readiness to begin consultations with Washington on reciprocal tariffs, which, as we mentioned, are expected in April. What does Mr. Trump's speech indicate in terms of American policies towards Asia? We're joined by Chong Jia-yen. He's an associate professor of political science at the National University of Singapore and a non-resident scholar of Carnegie, China. Thanks for joining us, Professor Chong. Now, before we focus on Asia specifically, let's look at this speech, this address by Mr. Trump. As our correspondent mentioned in Washington, D.C., it's not normal for this type of address to a joint session to speak so much about the past. It's meant to be looking forward, I suppose, explaining, justifying actions in the last 43 days and building support for what you intend to do for the rest of your time in office. What did Mr. Trump do on that front?
So in terms of looking at the past, he spent quite a bit of time blaming President Biden and the Biden administration for a lot of the problems that the United States continues to have. Some of these are structural. Some of these are potentially exacerbated by things like the tariffs that he's putting in place on Mexico and Canada. Now, the other thing that President Trump paid a lot of attention to was on tariffs. He has said previously that this is a beautiful word that, if applied correctly, can do many things. I mean, he seems to have this view that tariffs are a way to beat others over the head into submission, or else, a way to raise revenue. Now, this is a claim. How that will actually play out is a little bit less known, right? And certainly President Trump did not lay out those details in his speech. And so it's unclear how much tariffs will actually earn the United States in revenue, and how that offsets whatever increase in costs, especially that middle and lower class Americans might feel.
Professor Chong, the implicit suggestions that tariffs could be a means to an end or an end in themselves for Mr. Trump is not really clear what they are meant to be. But let's assume they're part of a bigger picture in terms of how you manage foreign policy, how you manage relations with both friends, allies, partners, adversaries. If tariffs are part of this strategic picture, do we get a sense of this big picture at this point, 43 days into Mr. Trump's second term in office?
Well, at this point, we know that President Trump likes tariffs. To what end, it is less clear, because while the tariffs are a possible means to force others to give in, to seek compromise, given the importance of the U.S. market. But tariffs are not a cost-free tool, right? To get the other side to cave in, there possibly needs to be some pain, and the other sides will put in tariffs in retaliation, as indeed we've seen with Canada, we've seen with the PRC as well. And this all becomes a net tax, right, on the U.S. consumer. So I suppose, if there is a plan to use tariffs to some sort of end, the view is that whatever tax or costs that come with the tariffs, the United States is better able to bear them than any other actor. Now, that is a bet, that is a claim. Whether that is actually the case, I think remains to be seen.
Okay, it looks like we're focusing a great deal on tariffs, but we have to, because as far as Asia is concerned, the only substantial move we've seen from the Trump administration on Asia has been in the area of tariffs, and specifically, as you mentioned, on the People's Republic of China. We've seen him turn his focus on the Middle East, those startling remarks on Gaza. We've seen him look to Europe, on Ukraine, North America, Canada, Mexico. But on Asia, all we have seen so far materially is in the area of tariffs. Do we see any clearer indication of where Mr. Trump will be on Asia in the second term in office?
So we've seen a couple of things on Asia. So one is the tariffs. The other is this trying to move chip-making technology back into the United States, shipbuilding technology back in the United States. Why this is, Asia-specific is because a lot of the chip-making is in Taiwan, it is in South Korea, right? And with the shipbuilding, a lot of it currently is in the PRC, of course, but also Japan and South Korea. So insofar as President Trump is putting restrictions in order to move these technologies to the US, it will affect Asia, will affect supply chains in Asia. Now, with the tariffs more specifically, a lot of the focus is on the PRC, but how this affects a lot of the rest of Asia is because Asia trades a lot with both the United States and the PRC. What the rest of Asia does, it's some sort of middleman, right? It gets capital from the US. It will then produce goods that it will sell to the PRC, or components it buys from PRC that it then finishes and sells to the United States. So it's part of this sort of circulation of goods and capital. Any sort of hit on the PRC side and in retaliation, the US side will squeeze all these middlemen, right? So everyone from South Korea to Taiwan to Malaysia to Singapore will all feel this squeeze. So while they've not been the sort of direct focus so far, with the partial exception of the sort of reciprocal tariff stuff, as the trade war heats up, a lot of Asia will feel that heat.
All right, well, there'll be indirect heat, at least for now, but the direct heat the PRC is feeling. Of course, the NPC and the CPPCC launching their Lianghui starting as of this week. And earlier we spoke to our correspondent in Beijing. She was speaking to her expert guest, and he said, my colleague mentioned lip service over the years paid to boosting domestic consumption. Her guest said there's now a gradually more serious approach by the Chinese government to actually really boosting domestic consumption. Did you see any key targets, figures, data out from the NPC, the government work report, that suggests China is finally getting serious on this issue of boosting domestic consumption, given that you've got a US administration that is giving it real reason to treat this with some matter of urgency?
Right. So the bit that caught my eye was the focus on government spending, so fiscal measures, given the fact that private consumers in the PRC don't feel confident enough to spend their own money. There's not much investment going in, especially compared to the past. So, two elements of GDP are sort of put aside, and there's a lot of uncertainty with trade. So that leaves the sort of government aspect. So the fiscal element, I suppose what that tries to do is to pump more money into the economy, get people jobs, more secure jobs, perhaps better jobs, higher pay, so that they feel more confident in the end to spend, and that will possibly boost consumer spending, or at least that is the hope. However, that's also not without these strings attached, right? With government spending, one thing that I've sort of come across with the PRC trying to finance it is, in part by debt. So we also know that the PRC, has a very serious issue with national debt at this point in time. So trying to pump through fiscal measures will further increase that debt, and that may get you consumption in the short term, but that raises the sort of debt question in the longer term. Perhaps the hope is that consumption will rise enough, that you have enough of a boost, that the longer term issues about servicing and paying off that debt become less of an issue. Again, I suppose this is a measure that could work, but we'll really have to see how it works through the system. The Beijing government over the years have tried various ways to boost consumption, various ways to boost the Chinese economy after COVID, but they've all sort of fallen short. So I suppose for this time around, we have to see how it actually works through the system, whether we will have another round of disappointment, or we really will see some real progress.
In fact, the government may be preparing for more debt, raising its budget deficit target from 3 to 4% of GDP at also today's NPC session. Thanks to Chong Jian, Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. Still ahead on East Asia tonight, Liu Jiakun wins architecture's top prize, the Pritzker. He has more than 30 projects in China and has been featured in the Venice Biennale. Japan is getting some relief as it continues to battle its worst wildfire in decades. Today's rain and snowfall offering a glimmer of hope to end the inferno that has been raging for more than a week now. The fire around Ofunato City was preceded by record low rainfall in the region. Many residents and officials are hoping the wet weather this morning and possible rain in the coming days will help extinguish the blaze. This is the largest wildfire the country has seen since the late 1980s, having scorched nearly 3,000 hectares of land. That's around a tenth of the city's total area. More than 4,000 residents have had to be moved to evacuate, have been forced to evacuate, as 2,000 firefighters battle to contain the fire. A Chinese architect, Liu Jiakun, has won the prestigious Pritzker Prize, dubbed the Nobel for architecture. The jury recognized Liu for designs that celebrate the lives of ordinary citizens. The 69-year-old has worked on more than 30 projects in China, ranging from cultural institutions to commercial buildings. Liu says his aim is not to have a strongly recognizable style, but to create a beautiful, just and dignified living environment, which balances commercial needs with human needs. Organizers cited his 2015 project called West Village in Chengdu, a 5-storied project that includes pathways for cyclists and pedestrians.
你要给公众留出他应得的公共空间，这样一个城市的发展才是积极健康的，而不是完全的高密度，使人们居住在人生的抽屉里、盒子里啊，连个去的地方都没有，而且没有交流的空间。
Appetite for business jets in China is healthy, bouncing back from previous bureaucratic hurdles to ownership and operations. CNA's Yasmin Yonkers looks at how the Chinese business aviation sector has evolved.
Chinese exhibitors at the inaugural Business Aviation Asia Forum and Expo in Singapore were in a buoyant mood on day 2 after the 2 sessions confident report on economic growth amid trade tensions and global uncertainties. It's also been a good decade for infrastructure growth in China to support their industry.
Thank you very much. I think from the airport's perspective, in the past years, there are so many improvements on the FBO side. The year, I think the number of general aviation airports is about 467, and for the civil aviation transportation airports is 263. About the regulations, I think from several years ago, when China's central government to encourage the development of general aviation and business aviation side, so there were a lot of changing on the regulation side. Even by the end of 2023, there was change in the airspace management side, and that's really a big, significant change for the aviation industry.
Chinese business aviation companies here tell me that the planes that they have on offer for sale or charter often sell out, and that high net worth clients are getting increasingly sophisticated in choosing the jets they need, whether for leisure or long-haul travel. Fractional ownership is attracting more and more clients. It's typical for some 120 owners to share 3 jets and divide up the time. Beyond high flyer needs, business jets have wider purpose to benefit the Chinese population over vast distances.
Another one is about air medical services. In the past several years in China, they developed a lot for helicopter emergency medical services, and also there are some services for from the large airplane transportations. The demand for business aviation in China also trickles to elsewhere in the region. Southeast Asia, with its luxury destinations and wealth of resources, is where the Chinese high flyers travel to for work and play, and high net worth people in this region are also turning to private jets. Naturally, infrastructure would have to catch up. Yasmin Yonkers, CNA, Singapore.
And that's East Asia Tonight this Wednesday. Don't forget headlines anytime at cna.asia, plus on Facebook and YouTube.